Hi, this is Dr. Culkin, here to talk about the reading for Topic 4, Modern Economy and Modern Governance. During the second half of the 19th century, the United States underwent dramatic changes. The country industrialized and urbanizing, transforming the pace of life forever, as America took advantage of its enormous resources to become a rich and powerful nation. The development of the railroad, which began before the Civil War, was central to this transformation. Now we think of trains when we take a trip, if we think of them at all. But in the 19th century, the railroad revolutionized the kinds of goods that could be purchased and the areas of the country in which people could live comfortably. Trains allowed goods to be moved farther, more quickly, as eventually over 100,000 miles of track was laid down. And eventually all the tracks were also standardized. And moving goods more quickly meant more money for the railroads and for the companies producing the goods that were being moved around the country. As the railroads spread across the country, moreover, so did settlement. Sometimes towns were founded just to support a train station to serve the surrounding areas. In 1869, the dream of a transcontinental railroad was achieved, meaning people could easily travel across the entire continent. In the 1890s, as railroad companies suffered from building too fast, bankers led by J.P. Morgan reorganized the industry, cutting costs and raising profits. Soon there were only 7 giant railroad companies controlling everything, and they answered to the bankers, setting patterns that other industries would soon follow. The development of steel companies was also critical to American industry in the second half of the 19th century. The Bessemer process, which you should remember from History 10, allowed steel to be made cheaply, and cheap steel meant skyscrapers and railroads could be built. As with the railroads, large powerful companies working with bankers dominated the industry by the turn of the century. The 19th century was also a time of remarkable innovation. Some inventions transformed communication, including the transatlantic cable and eventually the telephone. Some transformed how people worked, such as the typewriter and the cash register. There were new kinds of food, such as breakfast cereal. At the same time, refrigerated railroad cars made it possible to have fresh fruit all year round all over the country, not just places like California and Florida. Motion picture film was developed, as was the phonograph or record player. Most important were Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse's inventions of ways to harness electricity to create electric lights and convert electricity into mechanical power. So suddenly you could plug things in your house and have them work. So what would our lives be like without these inventions? That they really all came out of this part of the 19th century. Now, the lives of the workers staffing the factories that these new inventions, as well as many other products, came out of were difficult. They worked long days, and there were few safety regulations to protect them. And many children were among these workers working the long days in the unsafe factories. Working conditions did begin to improve to some extent through the emergence of the labor movement and through unions. The idealistic Knights of Labor was eventually supplanted by the American Federation of Labor, which argued for practical changes such as shorter days, safer working conditions, and higher wages. And one thing they argue for is something we would like to call the weekend, where you get 2 days off a week. The AFL was willing to organize strikes and boycotts to achieve these ends. By 1901, there were more than 1 million members of the union. But the AFL did not let women workers join and discouraged African Americans from joining. And many Americans remained suspicious of unions, feeling they shouldn't exist in a capitalistic society. And animosity only grew after the Haymarket Square riot, during which a bomb was thrown into a labor rally, linking the labor movement to anarchy and violence in many Americans' minds. Urbanization also dramatically transformed Americans' lives. More and more people moved from farms and small towns to cities, and by 1900, 1/3 of the country resided in urban areas, and that would be 1/2 of the country within the next 20 years. New technologies allowed cities to build up in the form of skyscrapers, so suddenly you could have more people working in a smaller geographic area. At the same time, new technologies also allowed people to live in the suburbs, because you had streetcars coming in and out. So affluent people could live in the suburbs and still work in the city. But for the people who lived and worked in urban areas, conditions were overcrowded and often unsanitary and dangerous. Drinking water came from the same water sources where cities dropped their waste, and crime grew. The homicide rate tripled in the 1880s. Now, immigrants consisted a large part of the population of these growing cities. By 1890, immigrants made up 15% of the population. That was more than 9 million people. After 1800, more and more immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe instead of Northern and Western Europe, which had been the traditional sources of immigration to the United States. Often Jewish or Catholic, with few skills that transferred to the working world of the United States, they faced even more prejudice than earlier generations of immigrants. Many American citizens worried that these newcomers could not be assimilated into American society and that they would somehow weaken the infrastructure of the country or the morality of the country. Despite these concerns, this new group of immigrants both immigrated themselves into their new home while also leaving their stamp, introducing new foods, holidays, and languages into the American landscape. Okay, well that's it for this week, and I'll see you next week. As always, remember to submit the reading questions and participate in the discussion board.